Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to use useContext and useReducer. Let's go ahead and let's hop right into it. I'm going to go ahead and show you my screen. And on this screen you can see that we have our terminal. This is going to be our starting point, okay? This starting point allows us to begin creating a React app. We're hopping right into it as I get my command switched up. And we want to run the command npx create react app. And I'm going to call this context example stuff, because why not? Okay. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go over exactly how to set up an application to utilize useContext and useReducer and how to do it properly, because there are many ways that you can just avoid doing any of that. So we're going to do this properly. Okay, once you have your terminal where you want it to be and it is done installing, go ahead and pull that up inside of your VS Code. To start off with, let's go ahead and let's start this up in the browser so that we can see what's going on. Best if we end up seeing all this here. Okay, looks like it's working. Now, first off, before we make any alterations, we need to set up our development environment so that we can best organize our code. We do this by creating two folders. Our typical components folder, which we're used to, and then we come up with a new folder called state. This is where we will store all of our state files for context and reducer. Once we've done that, go ahead and go over to your app component. We're clearing out everything inside of the div, not the div itself, just inside the div. You can also clear out the import logo. And then inside of the CSS, I have some boilerplate CSS that I like to use for these types of things. So you are more than welcome to look at the GitHub link below, and you can go there, copy the code from the app.css, because it's just boilerplate. We won't be doing any CSS in this tutorial. It's just some starter stuff. So. Okay, and with that, we're pretty much ready to go. We'll get started coding. First things first, I always like to start with my header, right? And this header is going to be really basic. It's just going to be a header tag with an h2 element that just says context and reducer. And I'm going to place that inside of my app component. There we go. Very, very fancy like. All right. And I like to have a header just so I know what app is running at any given time. Since I have so many VS Codes open, it's very minimal effort to create a header and display what's going on. All right, next up, create a form component, form.jsx. This div is going to have a class name of card. And inside of this div, we're going to have a form tag. And this form tag is going to have an h2 that says change name. It's going to have an input, and it's going to have a button that says change. Now underneath the form tag, we are going to have another div. This div is going to have a button, followed up by immediately another button. And they will be respectively minus and plus. And so this is the boilerplate to get this component up and off the ground. Go ahead and pause here if you need to continue to copy. But now let's go place this inside of our app.js immediately under our header. We can just begin to see it here on the page. There we go. Very, very fancy like. got change name, we've got input field. It's all fantastic, right? Now inside of form, we want a couple different things. We're going to need a piece of state to capture values from the input field. And then we're going to need a submit function to handle the submit of the form. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's start with the piece of state. We're going to import useState up here at the top. And we are going to do const new name and set new name. This is going to be equal to useState, and it's going to initialize as an empty string. Now we do need to bind this to the input field, so we are going to say on change. We're going to have a function called change name. So let's create that function now. Const change name. And what it will do is it will take in E for the event that triggers it. And we will set new name to e.target.value. So we have just bound the state or the input field to state. Now we need to do our double bind and say that the value is whatever new name is. So we have not only bound once, but twice. Okay. Next, let's create a function called handle submit. And it will also take in E for the event that triggers it. And the very first line, because it's a form that is going to be triggering this submission, the very first line needs to be e.prevent default invoked. This is going to prevent the default behavior of the function of sending information off and refreshing the page. We don't want that. We don't want that to happen. We want to stay on this page. We don't want to refresh. We just want to run a specific series of functions. Perfect. And for now, since we don't have anywhere to actually submit this information to, let's just console log submit. I can type. Okay. So on this form, remove the action and type on submit. We want to run the function handle submit. Very, very nice. Very, very good. Now we do have these two buttons down here, and they are minus and plus buttons, increase and decrease. So we need to have two more functions called increase and decrease. So we're going to do const increase. And for now, let's just console.log a string of plus. And we will have a similar function for decrease. And rather than a plus, I'll bet you can guess what we'll put. It is going to be a minus. Now we just need to tie those to the buttons themselves. We will say when you click the minus button, we will decrease something. And when you click the plus button, we will increase. There we go. And now at this point, if I pull up a console, okay, and if I move my camera, you can then see that when we click various things, such as the minus button, the plus button, and even the change button, we get our appropriate console logs down there in our console. Fantastic. That's exactly what we want to see. And so we'll come back to this component once we actually have a piece of state to hold all of our information in and to actually interact with, because right now we don't have anything. I'm going to put me back over here. And we're now going to create 5 components, okay? These 5 components, activated my webcam. Woohoo! These 5 components, I'm going to list them off in the phonetic language. So we're going to have alpha.jsx, okay? And these phonetic components are just going to have a header tag with their name inside of them. Not a header tag, a heading tag. So for instance, I have a div with an h1 of alpha. I have the h1 because alpha was first. Makes sense. So now let's create another component called Bravo. We're going to have an h2 with Bravo because Bravo was the second component that we created. And lastly, we'll create a third called Charlie. And we will have an h3 of Charlie. Now once we have this information set, the only reason we have these components is to express how context can work inside of a component tree without having to pass any props. And so in order to actually visualize this, we now need to reverse the components and place them inside each other. I'm going to place Charlie inside of Bravo, Bravo inside of Alpha, and Alpha inside of the app. So we go to the Bravo component. Underneath our h2, we will put the Charlie component. Let's go to Alpha underneath the h1 and put the Bravo component. And then let's go to app and underneath the form, put the Alpha component. And now if we take a look at our browser, sure enough, we can see that we have our form up here, followed by Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. That is very, very good. We are on our way. I'm going to keep my camera over here for now so that you can actually see the app. Perfect. And so the goal is to have information be changed in the form and then displayed in Charlie. For instance, let's take a look at this. Let me go ahead and pull up one of these. We have our app component right here. Correct? This is our app component. And inside of our app component, we have our form component. And then we have Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. A, B, C. Oh, excuse me. We have A, B, and C. And the app component contains all of these through Alpha, and then Alpha contains Bravo, and then Bravo contains Charlie. The goal with this app is to have a piece of state that is out here, kind of unique, okay, that can serve and receive information from form, and then send that information over to the Charlie component. The reason why we want this is because if we used a traditional useState environment, and so I'll use a light blue for this, a traditional useState environment would require a piece of state here at app, and we would change that information to form, we would pass it to Alpha, pass it to Bravo, pass it to Charlie. That is pretty inefficient, right? That's a lot of props dotting that we don't want to do. And so we get to avoid that as long as we have this external item here with context and reducer. These stay over here, and with context and reducer, we're able to seamlessly tie different pieces of our app together. Fantastic. So let's implement it, shall we? Let's go to our state folder. Actually, let me clear my whiteboard so I can still use some of those. And inside of our state, we are going to create something called global context.jsx. Okay. Now, typically you would name this something a little bit more relevant to what you're doing. For instance, if this is where you house all of your authentication functions, you would call it something similar to useContext. In our instance, this is just kind of a global all-in-one, so it's global context. Now, to get this file started off right, you need to import create context and useReducer from React. That's step one. Step two is you create an initial state of what you want to house inside of your application. For us, I just want to house name and count. Okay, name will be a string, count will be an integer. I'm going to initialize name as my own name. Okay, I suggest that you do the same just to see how this can all work. And count will start off at 0 because it makes sense. Everything starts at 0, including us. Next up, we actually get to create our piece of context. So we're going to say const global context is equal to create context invoked. Okay? And we will leave that create context empty for now. Okay? Using this method, we don't have to put anything in there. Excuse me. Perfect. So now we get to create a component called global context provider that takes in props. Okay. And creating the component here inside of the context file is actually very nice and convenient. In previous days, you would sometimes house your context inside of your app component, or other places, and it was just inconvenient. This allows us to have all of our context code here, and it might get confusing, but I hope it is understandable. Perfect. Moving forward, very first thing inside of our provider is going to be a reducer that takes in state and action. Okay. This reducer is a function that will handle requests to alter this initial state. And the way it does that is we will have a switch statement that looks at what type of action is being sent to this reducer. Okay. I often think of the action type as maybe 911 calls. Are we calling for police help, fire department help, ambulance help, right? Medical. Depending on what type of action you call 911 for, you then get a different response. Similar item here is we are sending up a specific action type. Depending on what type of action we want, we get a different result. But however, the default result is going to just be to return state. Okay. It does take in whatever the current value of initial state is after all of the alterations. That's what this first parameter is. And so if we don't have a particular action type, well, we just want to make sure that the current value of state remains the same. We do that with a default here. Okay. Outside of our reducer, I'm going to put a space there so it's easier to see. Outside of our reducer, we are now going to implement our useReducer. Okay. We've made a reducer, time to use it. So how do we do that? Well, similar to useState, we will use square brackets to identify state and dispatch. And this will be equal to useReducer. And we will pass in initial state and reducer. No, excuse me, I made a mistake. You have to swap these two. When implementing useReducer, the reducer function goes first, followed by the state. And so make sure to not make that mistake. So state, dispatch are being identified from useReducer. We have our reducer being passed in and our initial state. That's the magic. Now, our return statement. We are going to return global context dot provider. And it does have a value prop. And so when you're implementing context, you will use this provider tag before you are allowed to consume any other information, okay? And the value of this, right here where my cursor is, the value is going to be an object that has state and dispatch inside of it. The nice thing about using useReducer with context is you will only ever have two variables that you need to keep track of. Okay. Super duper handy, super duper clean, super duper dope. I don't know. Okay. Now, as far as what goes on inside of these tags, because we're going to place something in here that's a little bit unique, okay? And what that is we are going to reference props.children. And so this is a little bit of a unique situation. You might not have ever seen this before. What we're doing is we are going to be implementing this tag right here, this component, as an opening and a closing tag surrounding our application, okay? And so when you're surrounding something with a component, anything inside of those tags is technically a child. This allows you to pass information anywhere throughout your component tree as you need, because I can implement this tag anywhere. That might be very, very confusing. I apologize, it's a hard concept to wrap around. So, let's see how that works rather than just explain it. At the bottom of your file, you will need to export global context provider, and then you will export default global context, like so. If you need to pause to finish coding, do so now. Okay, time to implement this. Let's go over to our app, or excuse me, go over to our... Okay, time to implement this. Let's go over to our index component. And as you can see, we've got pretty bare bones. It's basic, right? Be sure to import your global context provider. And this tag is going to wrap around your app, like so. And so in this instance, app is technically a child of global context provider. If I can make this any more helpful, we can take a look at this. Let me pop this open. And when we have this, you can imagine that this app right here is going in to global context provider via props. And then from props, it is then being placed right here as props.children. Because when you wrap something with a component tag that's opening and closing, anything in the middle is a child and can be referenced with props.children. Okay, hopefully that makes at least a lick of sense. Time to see if we can do anything with this, right? Let's make sure that our app has not broken. And sure enough, our app is still running, which is a good sign. So, let's head on over to our Charlie component. And underneath our h3, put a div with the class name of card. Inside of here, we're going to have an h3 that says name. And then we'll have another one with count. And there we go. We can see them down there. At this point, it's time for us to consume the context, and so we need to import useContext up here at the top, and we need to import global context. Once you've imported both of those, inside of your Charlie component, you're going to destructure state from useContext, and you're going to pass in global context as the context that you want to use. From here, inside of your h3, you can now reference state.name and state.count. And as you can see, we have our pieces popping up down here at the bottom of the screen. So that's good. We're able to have information inside of our context file and then consume it and display it inside of our Charlie component. And we did so without passing props from app to alpha to Bravo to Charlie. We didn't do any of that. We just said, hey, I want to use this context. And that's pretty cool. That is pretty cool. Okay, so what do we do next? Let's go to our form component. Let's make it so that we can change some of this information. Okay. So at this point, if you do want to go and make copies of everything, what we have so far is pretty boilerplate as far as like what's inside the global context file. You're more than welcome to go make a copy. I will not. I'm going to continue forward coding. So inside the form.jsx, you need to import useContext and import global context. And then the same thing that we've done inside of Charlie, you will destructure dispatch from useContext passing in global context. So for our increase function right here, let's remove the console log and instead type dispatch. And dispatch will always take an object as an argument. Inside this object, very nearly every time you will have some sort of type. And traditionally we will list the type in all caps. For instance, increase, well, what's the type of function we want to perform? Increase. Now we can copy this because it's going to be very, very similar for decrease. I'm just going to type decrease right there. And so we've got two dispatches already. Okay. All we need to do is we now go into the global context file and actually give these types meaning. So let's navigate over to our global context. And inside of our reducer, we have a new case. This case is increase. And what do we want to do when we send the type of increase? Well, we want to keep state the same, except that count is going to have a new value. So we're spreading state, saying, hey, all the previous values that were there, to keep that the same. Okay. But state.count is going to be equal to whatever the previous value of state was, but we're going to add one. So count is equal to state.count plus 1. And we can immediately duplicate this, change one of the increases to decrease, and change the plus to minus, so that now we have not only an increase, we have a decrease as well. Let's take a look at how this works. Reminder that we have our pieces of state down here that we can visibly see. And as I click the buttons, they actually go up and they go down. How very, very nice. So nice. Okay. Now it's time to do the same, but this time we're going to use a form, an input field. And so inside of your handle submit for your input field for your form, get rid of the console log that says submit. And we are going to dispatch a type of change name. However, in this instance, because we're receiving information, we need to tag that information into this dispatch. We can do that with payload. And in this case, our payload will be the new name. And then once we've dispatched that, we are then allowed to set new name back to being an empty string so that that input field can go back to being empty. All we have to do is go back over to our global context file, and let's create a case for change name. And very similar, we want to keep all the values of state the same using a spread. However, name is going to be equal to whatever payload we sent up with our action. So name is going to set equal to action.payload. So let's see this in action. Currently, my name is Brady, as you can see. But let's see. Let's see if I change it to Tommy. Sure enough, you can see that it swapped back to Tommy. And I can do this again. Let's do Jerry. And it changed to Jerry. So now we've been able to set up useContext, useReducer, and we did all of this fairly easily. This is going to be a very good, reliable way to implement context. I hope a lot of this made sense. If you are looking for any further information, by all means, feel free to contact me. Let me know if there's anything that you need help with. But aside from that, I wish you guys the best of luck in your coding, and I'll see you all later. Peace.